When the topics obedience and humility are mentioned, what do you immediately think of? Too often people confuse humility with humiliation. They think that being humble means being a spiritual doormat, that they must think of themselves as less than anyone else and need to allow others to walk all over them. Similarly, when people hear obedience, it conjures up images of authoritarian structures where people commit atrocities in the name of obedience, or that obedience means being literally subject to the arbitrary whims of another person. It is unfortunate that these concepts are so misunderstood. They are absolutely central to understanding Benedictine spirituality, and indeed the concepts that underlie them are crucial to understanding Christianity and the spiritual path in general. Humility as a value is actually a profound expression of who we really are. We have been created in the image of God, and to be humble is to live in that awareness. Then, as we've been saying, we need structures, ways of living to make values real in our lives. Obedience, then, is a structure that will help us get past our egocentricity, our self-centeredness, so that we can come to the fullness of humility, a place where we reflect fully and live out our true God-given nature. So let's begin with the value of humility. In Chapter 7, the longest chapter in the Rule, Benedict sets forth his understanding of what humility means in the life of a monk. He uses the image of the ladder from the story of Genesis in Jacob's vision of the ladder to heaven to talk about how we make progress. For Benedict, humility isn't something we achieve instantly. It is something that takes the work of a lifetime. Coming to humility is a long process of being open to the transforming power and presence of God in our lives. We climb the ladder slowly in many small steps. Coming to humility is always about allowing God to work in us. If we think we are achieving humility all by ourselves, we will have to start all over again at the bottom of the ladder. As we take a deeper look at this chapter of the Rule, let's try to create a definition of humility. We will begin by saying that humility is the journey of giving up our self-centeredness in order to create more room for God and others in our heart. Humility is the work of a lifetime, and all the structures of monastic life are intended to help the monk come to this point of humility. When we talk about humility, we are entering into the realm of how we understand our fundamental sense of self, how we think of and experience ourselves in relationship to others and to God. Unfortunately, it seems to be human nature that our fundamental sense and understanding of ourselves is usually warped. We do not understand ourselves to be as we were created by God. Instead, we have a tendency to think either too much or too little of ourselves. When we discussed the role of psychology in the first unit, we said that this sense of self, our basic self-image, is the role of the ego. The ego is our basic sense of competence and self-worth that gives us the strength to function in the world. Unfortunately, the ego is also that part of our basic sense of self that is seldom in tune with the reality of God's image of us. Most of us suffer from too much or too little ego. We either think we are much more than we really are, in which case we are arrogant, believing that we are better, more intelligent, more capable than most everyone else, or we think we are less than everyone else. We think that we aren't as smart, we aren't as capable, we are generally less than everyone else. So, whether we think more of ourselves than is our due, or if we think less of ourselves, either way, our perspective is always centered on ourselves. Whether we think, I am much better than all those other people, or I am much worse than all those other people, The emphasis is always on I. Egocentricity can take either form, either too much self-esteem or not enough. We are used to thinking of the problem of arrogance, of having an inflated ego that creates a sense of being much better than others, but we also have to be aware of the problem of lack of self-esteem as also being a form of egocentricity. We live in a time and a culture that has discovered the problem of people having poor self-image. This is a problem many of us have. We think we aren't very gifted, we really aren't worth very much, we don't really deserve things. But the problem, again, is that we are focused on ourselves, albeit in a negative way. When we denigrate ourselves, think we aren't very good or gifted, then we are failing to claim our basic nature as beloved children of God, created in God's image. If we are arrogant, we take away the credit from God and give it to ourselves. If we think we are basically unworthy, then we are also taking away the credit from God, who made us worthy and gifted. The reality is that when we talk about humility, we are talking about accepting ourselves as God sees us, not necessarily as we see ourselves. True humility is about knowing and accepting our true and rightful sense of ourselves. We are created in God's image, we are loved and worthy of love, and this is the key. Everyone else is equally created in God's image, loved and worthy of love. True humility means that we are not more than or less than anyone else. We don't think too much of ourselves or too little. In true humility, we have come to the place where we are able to love ourselves and others equally. We finally have room to be centered on God, centered on others, because we are no longer centered on ourselves as being either greater or less than we really are. True humility is a place of great freedom and love. We are free from all the things that have kept us unable to see the true reality of ourselves, others, and God. Now we have the freedom to truly love as we have been loved. This is the place where Benedict describes the top of the ladder of humility, the goal that we come to after the hard work of spiritual growth. He says, "Now, therefore, after ascending all these steps of humility, the monk will quickly arrive at that perfect love of God which casts out fear. Through this love, all that he once performed with dread, he will now begin to observe without effort, as though naturally, from habit, no longer out of fear of hell, but out of love for Christ, good habit, and delight in virtue." We see here a description of spiritual maturity. This is a description of a person who has worked through the crippling sense of fear that seems to keep most of us from our true freedom in Christ. It is also a description of transformation. All the hard work of climbing the ladder of humility has had success. We come to a place where a deep knowledge of God's love has permeated our heart and made us different people. We naturally and easily are able to reflect the reality that we have become the presence of Christ in the world. Our sense of self has become a sense of being for others. So how do we become humble? We may say that this is a value, that we want to become humble, but how do we go about it? This is where the tradition of monastic structures and practices can give us some unexpected insights. As we begin to look at the monastic structure of obedience, we begin with what it literally means. The word comes from the Latin ob audire, to listen, to hear. So the concept of obedience is rooted in listening, hearing. As we've said before, the beginning, the foundation of Benedictine spirituality is listening. We have to be awake, aware, open to listen to the many ways God speaks to us. Unfortunately, most of us are not especially good listeners. We aren't really open to God, to others, or even the deepest stirrings in ourselves. We don't listen well because we are so distracted and preoccupied by so many things, many or most of which aren't particularly important. We don't listen well because, as we talked about in describing humility, most of us are centered on ourselves. It is hard to listen because we have to create space for the other, for God, or again, even our own deepest longings and reality of our heart. This deep listening is critical because if we don't have the ability or willingness to be open to ourselves, to the people we come in contact with, how will we be able to truly listen to the whisperings, the still small voice of God in our lives? So we have to begin by becoming conscious of how and even whether we really listen. One way to tell whether we are really listening on a deep level is to check how and whether we respond to what we have heard. This is where transformation truly begins to happen. It takes a lot of hard work to truly listen to ourselves, to others, to God. But then, to actually respond takes another level of risk and action. The kind of response we are talking about when we talk about monastic obedience is the response that requires us to look past our own egocentric desires. In other words, if my boss asked me to stay late at work and I had already made plans to go out to dinner with friends or family, I have to listen to my boss and truly hear what she is saying. Hopefully, what she is asking is something for the greater good of everyone. There is an emergency, something has come up that has to be taken care of right away, that sort of thing. As I listen, I have to make sure that I'm really hearing what this other person has to say, and that I'm not so focused on my own needs that I can't hear what is being said. Then, even if I know that this is a legitimate request, I have to respond in a way that I get past my desire to put my own needs first. I may know that this is a legitimate request, but I can still think, well, why doesn't she ask so-and-so? I know he doesn't have plans for the evening. In other words, I can truly listen, but still respond in a way that focuses on my needs rather than those of the other person. Now, in this example, I may go ahead and do what the boss asks me, stay late and help with some kind of problem or emergency. I may have a variety of reasons for doing so. I like my boss and want to help. I know that other people are depending on my help. Not staying could jeopardize my job. I didn't really want to go out with my friends. So I could have a variety of motivations, but chances are there is a strong dose of pragmatism involved. There is probably at least some element of this decision that will be beneficial for me. I'll get something out of responding to the request. Now, this is the way that monastic obedience is different from self-serving or pragmatic obedience. When we are talking about obedience in a monastic context, we are talking about an attitude and actions that will lead to transformation. The practice and monastic structure of obedience is not about putting up with some occasional difficulties to get something done. Monastic obedience is about creating a way of life in which we consciously decide to put aside our own ego, our own sense of control, our own personal desires, in order to let God and others come first. Let's look at a selection from chapter 5 of the Rule to see how Benedict understood obedience. Talking about monks, Benedict says, "It is love that impels them to pursue everlasting life. Therefore they are eager to take the narrow road of which the Lord says, 'Narrow is the road that leads to life.' They no longer live by their own judgment, giving in to their whims and appetites. Rather, they walk according to another's decisions and directions, choosing to live in a monastery and having an abbot or prioress over them. Men and women of this resolve unquestionably conform to the saying of the Lord, "I have come not to do my own will, but the will of him who sent me." We notice a couple of important things here. First, Benedict says that the motivation of anyone practicing obedience is love. A monk may be concerned about everlasting life, but they are compelled by love. This is something that we always need to be aware of when we make any decision. We need to be conscious of our motivations. Are we doing things out of love? Since the answer is frequently no, this is something that we continue to practice, we continue to work on. Second, this road of obedience is narrow. It isn't easy. We tend to think that if something is difficult, it really isn't worth doing, or we think that if it is difficult, we are probably not doing it right. It shouldn't be so hard. But obedience, as Benedict describes it, not living according to our own judgment, not giving in to our own whims and appetites, walking according to another's decisions and directions, is very difficult. Obedience in monastic spirituality means not being in control. Obedience strikes at the heart of our desire, our deep need for personal autonomy. We want to live according to our own whims and appetites. Anything that asks us to give up some of our desires is going to be extremely difficult. But here we see Benedict's model of obedience, Christ. Men and women of this resolve unquestionably conform to the saying of the Lord, "I have come not to do my own will, but the will of him who sent me." So our model of obedience is Christ. Of course, we have to be careful about our Christology here. Jesus' obedience to the Father was not a passive acquiescence. Jesus did not say, "Okay, I guess so, if that's what you want." We read of Jesus' struggle in the garden, his desire that this cup pass him by. We hear him recite Psalm 22 on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" This indicates obedience that is the struggle of someone with a strong sense of self, who is making a conscious, extremely difficult decision to give up his own will and desire for something much, much greater. Jesus is a model of healthy, conscious, difficult, appropriate obedience. The point of obedience, as Benedict puts it, is that we imitate Christ in doing the will of God rather than our own egocentric will. In other words, obedience means a deep listening and active response to what God is calling us to do, rather than what our more limited, self-centered desires call us to. So what does this kind of obedience look like in everyday life? For Benedict, talking about monks in a monastery, it meant being open and willing to do what someone else needed, rather than what the monk simply wanted to do. Monastic obedience means being open and responsive to the needs of the whole community. In very practical terms, we have a chance to get past our own ego, our own sense of needing to be in control, our own sense of complete autonomy every time we do something out of obedience. Once again, let's be clear. Obedience isn't blindly following orders. Monastic obedience, inside or outside a monastery, isn't having someone say jump and we automatically say how high. Monastic obedience is conscious, aware, willing. Obedience is about deciding to do something not of my choosing, for the good of others, and as a way to come to humility. In humility, we create a heart open to God. But how can I be open to God if I am so full of my own desires, my own sense of control, my need to have my own way all the time? It is obedience that allows us to become aware of our own sense of control and egocentricity, and to practice an imitation of Christ, a way of learning to do the will of God and not our own. And again, obedience is meant to lead to transformation. We have to be careful to be clear that obedience is not another way of being a doormat. Obedience is not passively doing something because we think we have no choice. Obedience is not doing what someone else says because we think we can't object. Obedience is only transformational if we feel absolutely free to say no. It is transformational if we know that obedience is really a free choice. So as we try to create structures and practices of monastic obedience in our life, we need to be conscious of the many, many decisions we make every day. We need to be conscious of our attitudes, our assumptions, our motivations. Maybe a place to start is to get in a habit of asking ourselves some of these questions. How do we listen? Are we really open to what another person is saying? Open to hear God speaking in our life? Listening is not easy, but it is a skill and a practice we can work on. Second, are we in charge, or is God in charge? Again, we need to be conscious of how we make decisions, how we respond to what is being asked of us. Am I freely choosing to go beyond my automatic instinctual patterns, to listen to the promptings of God? Third, through obedience, we practice not being in control. We learn to empty ourselves to be filled with God. In this way, we remember that we are emulating Christ. When we freely, consciously choose to be open to God and to others. And this is the way we come to humility, to transformation, to love.